Joining us now is David K. Johnston, investigative journalist and author. You can check out his work at DC Report and also at Raw Story. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you, Anna.
So I wanted to start off by getting your thoughts on the economy in general, because the way the economy is covered in mainstream news outlets is very different from what I see in your reporting. You recently wrote a piece talking about the trade war and how devastating it is, not just for American workers today, but for generations to come. You talk a little bit about currency manipulation in China. But before we get to all of that, I want to put the trade war aside and just talk about how the average American worker is feeling today. Has the economy really improved under Donald Trump?
Well, it was improving since the end of the last recession, which was July of 2009. Job growth during the Obama administration, after the economy turned around, was running about 3% more per month than it has been under Trump. We had a spurt of wage growth in 2014 and 15, and then we fell back. The longer story here, Anna, is that the share of economic returns going to labor, which the government measures every month, has been in severe decline since the early 1950s. Essentially, more and more labor is being performed by capital. Imagine someone who gets a job hauling sacks of wheat, saves a little bit of money, buys a donkey, can carry more wheat, buys a cart for the donkey to pull, then buys a pickup truck, then buys a bigger truck. All that additional wheat is labor that's being done by capital. And it's a real fundamental problem for people who don't have highly skilled or intellectual jobs, but who depend on manual labor, people like my brother, who's now retired and disabled. So we need to think, I think, in a very long term about this. And essentially, the decline of the welfare of most American workers who do not have high skill, highly paid jobs tracks very well with the decline of unions, because most workers are commodities. They're, from an economic perspective, they're no different than a bushel of wheat. They can be replaced by other people, and it has allowed employers to drive down wages over a long period of time.
You know, in my previous segment, I covered the idea of universal basic income to serve as some sort of solution to the economic issues that you're raising right now. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. You know, Andrew Yang has really brought this to the forefront when it comes to Democratic debates. And I know that implementation means everything, but do you think that the UBI plan that he wants to put in place would really help the average American worker?
Well, there have been experiments done with universal basic income in several places, villages in India. We had sort of an experiment during the Nixon administration with families that were very poor, and it got shut down right away because they discovered that women were leaving their husbands who tended to disproportionately be wife beaters. We need to rethink fundamentally the notions we have of economics. The digital economy is not like anything in the past, and coming very quick now is the biological economy or genetic economy. Robert Ashford, who teaches in the law school at Syracuse University, where I've been teaching since 2009, although I'm not a lawyer, has long advocated the idea that everyone should own capital, and that workers should be paid partly in capital, and the earnings of that capital should buy them capital. The problem is a lot of people don't think long term, and they don't think prudently about spending less than they make. Universal basic income it's very important if we do that we think carefully about how we do it. The one thing we know from the experiments, Anna, is that people who are presented with the universal basic income don't just sit around and drink beer. They invest it to better their lives in education, in buying some equipment to make little, homemade goods and services. So I think we can reasonably conclude that if we implement it carefully, a universal basic income, and by that I mean everybody should get it, including Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, should encourage people to do more. And we need to recognize some people will use it as an opportunity to squander their lives, and that's part of the cost you pay for that.
So let's move on to the trade war. In one of your latest pieces, you write, China's trying to build enough confidence in its stability to make the yuan a second world currency, perhaps eventually supplanting the dollar. A shift away from the dollar would have enormous negative consequences for Americans. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What would those consequences be?
Well, first of all, the US government makes a lot of money because people overseas hold dollars. You go to a third world country with a lot of ones and fives in your pocket, and people will exchange money with you at levels that are often way apart from the official exchange rate because they trust the American dollar and they know they can use it. Having the dollar as a reserve currency helps keep the United States as a major financial center. And the Chinese here, it's very important to understand what they're doing. We have a president who is incapable of any long-term dedicated thought. And viewers should know I've been covering Donald longer than any other journalist, more than 30 years. Whereas the Chinese think in terms of we're here forever. So when I was in China a number of times, one of the things I was struck by is the roads that they're building. They make the Autobahn look like poor roads, which makes the U.S. interstate look like even poorer roads. They are building with an idea to a very long-term future, and they are investing in infrastructure, in railroads. They are building strong trading ties with other countries, and they are forcing the Australians, who are the most lapdog loyal people to America. Anything we ever ask for, the Canberra government, no matter what party is in charge, goes, yes, America, whatever it is you want. We are forcing the Australians to pivot towards Beijing and away from us. And Donald Trump is turning out to be the biggest help that the Chinese communists could ever imagine having because they think long term. And since they don't have to stand for election, if the Chinese people have to suffer for a few years because of Donald Trump's idiocy, well, too bad if you're a Chinese citizen.
So that's so fascinating. So I noticed something in your coverage of this, and I'm wondering if there's going to be an unintended consequence, and the unintended consequence would actually be good for Donald Trump. So you write, dictators in Beijing are lowering trade barriers, cutting tariffs with other countries, and strengthening their 16 existing trade alliances. Simultaneously, they're applying petty rules to complicate American business operations in China, squeezing profit margins of American companies there. So wouldn't that lead to American companies leaving China and coming back to the United States to do their manufacturing? And isn't that what Trump would want? Isn't that what we'd all want?
Yeah, sure, Anna. A lot of people think that, and I've been very critical of our trade deals with China. The problem is that Donald governs by tweet. Are you going to go invest $30 million in a factory if you're a small business owner? Because that investment, if it's based on Donald Trump's tweet today, could be worthless in a month. Mm-hmm. There's no strategy here. There's no long-term plan. China has essentially benefited from a labor arbitrage. I wrote in one of my best-selling books about how if you're a factory owner in America with 1,000 workers, nothing you can do will increase your profits more than to go to China, because you could cut your wage costs by as much as 90%, even if you have to hire many more people. Now, as China's costs rise, that labor arbitrage that is profiting off the difference between the US wage and the lower Chinese wage is going to narrow. But no, I don't think it's going to lead to a massive change. There is some additional manufacturing here in the US that's taken place while Trump is here. There's no question about that. But our future in manufacturing is in very complex, high-skilled jobs. And think about this. In an industrial economy, that's what we've been in for the last 200 years, or 150 anyway. In an industrial economy, efficiency eliminates jobs. Right. When steel was invented by the people in India more than 2,000 years ago, it took multiple years of labor to produce 1 ton of steel. If you watched Game of Thrones all the way through that show, what was the thing they kept talking about? Valerian steel. Mm-hmm. Today, it takes less than 40 minutes of labor to produce steel. Lumber factories that used to require hundreds of people in them to cut up logs into lumber, they're now automated, and some of them have only 8 employees, and that includes the front office. So the long-term future is not in manufacturing. And at the same time, we're allowing the Chinese to get ahead of us on things like the biological age because we're not taking risks, we're not investing in what is coming as the economics of the future, which is the ability to manipulate genes and make huge differences in biology. I mean, there are literally scientists who've left the US to go to Beijing because they can't get funded here, but the government in Beijing will fund them lavishly.
It's fascinating. David K. Johnston, it's always a pleasure to read your work, and it's a pleasure to speak with you today about the economy. I hope you'll come back again for a longer discussion. Always an honor to speak to you. Have a good one.
Thanks, I'm glad to do so.
Oh, did you like that video? Well, that's great, because you never have to miss another episode of No Filter. All you have to do is just hit the subscribe button below and ring the bell to get notified whenever we publish a new video.